Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sacker, published by Scholastic Incorporated. Reading level DRA level 38, guided reading level P. Chapter 26. Terence. Terence was a good athlete, but a bad sport. Rondi and Allison were playing two-square with a red ball. "Can I play?" asked Terence. "No," Allison replied. "You have to let me play," Terence said. "Louis says we have to share the balls." "Well, we're not sharing with you," said Allison. "Oh, let him play," said Rondi. "All right," said Allison. "We'll play three-square. You better play right." "I will," said Terence. Allison bounced the ball to Rondi. Rondi bounced it over to Terence. Terence caught it and kicked it over the fence. "You have to go get it," said Allison. "Shut up, Dixie Cup," Terence answered. Rondi ran and told Louis. DJ and Damien were playing basketball. "Uh-oh, here comes Terence," said Damien. "Hey, let me play," said Terence. "Get lost, Terence," said Damien. "You have to share the balls. Louis said so," said Terence. "Okay, but just throw it in the basket. Don't kick it," said Damien. "I won't," said Terence. First Damien took a shot. It bounced off the backboard and through the hoop. Next DJ took a shot. He threw it underhand, way up in the air. It came down through the hoop without touching the rim. Then Terence took a shot. He kicked it over the fence. "You idiot," said Damien. "Take a train, Peanut Brain," Terence answered. DJ went and told Louis. Stephen, Calvin, Joe, John, and Leslie were playing Spud. Stephen was it. Everyone else had a number. Stephen had to throw the ball up in the air and call out a number. The person who had that number had to try to catch it. "Can I play?" asked Terence. "No," said Calvin. "You'll just kick the ball over the fence." "No," said Joe. "No way," said John. "No," said Leslie. "Sure," said Stephen. "Newcomers are it." He gave the ball to Terence. "Just throw the ball up in the air and call out a number between 1 and 5. "Okay," said Terence. The children formed a circle around Terence. "1,000,000!" yelled Terence as he kicked the ball over the fence. "What'd you do that for?" asked Stephen. "Eat a frog, warthog," said Terence. Stephen ran and told Louis. Terence looked around. There was nothing to do. There were no balls left. Louis walked up to him. He was followed by Allison, Rondi, Damien, DJ, Stephen, Calvin, Joe, John, and Leslie. "What's the matter, Terence?" asked Louis. "There are no balls," said Terence. "Do you have a green ball?" "No," said Louis. "All my balls have mysteriously disappeared." "Darn it," said Terence. "There's nothing left to kick." "Nothing left to kick?" asked Louis. "Oh, I don't know about that. What do you think, Rondi? Is there anything left to kick?" Rondi thought a minute. Then she smiled. She was missing her two front teeth. "Yes, there's something left to kick," she said. "Well, where is it?" asked Terence. "Let me check with Allison," said Louis. "Allison, is there anything left to kick?" He winked at her. "There sure is," said Allison. "What? What?" asked Terence. "How about you, Damien?" asked Louis. "Can you think of anything?" Damien nodded his head yes. "Well, what is it?" asked Terence. He couldn't wait. "DJ, we got anything around here to kick?" asked Louis. DJ smiled. "Yes, we do," he said. "Give it to me! Give it to me!" Terence demanded. "I don't know if I should," said Louis. "What do you think, Calvin? Should I give it to him?" "I think you should," said Calvin. "You heard Calvin," said Terence. "Give it to me." "Not so fast," said Louis. "Leslie, should I give it to him?" "Oh, yes, I think he deserves it," said Leslie. "Give it to me! Give it to me!" Terence repeated. "Do you also think he deserves it, Joe?" asked Louis. "Yes, I think so," said Joe. "What about you, John?" asked Louis. "Definitely give it to him," John answered. Come on," said Terence. "Recess is almost over." "We'll leave it up to you, Stephen," said Louis. "Whatever he says goes." "Let him have it," said Stephen. "You heard him, Louis," said Terence. "Let me have it." "Okay," said Louis. He picked Terence up and kicked him over the fence. Chapter 27. Joy. Joy had forgotten her lunch at home. It was lunchtime. She was hungry. She didn't have a meal ticket. If she had had a meal ticket, she could have had a lunch from Miss Mush, the lunch teacher. She'd have to be terribly hungry to eat a lunch made by Miss Mush. Even a brown, empty paper sack would taste better. But that's how hungry Joy was. Damien hadn't forgotten his lunch. He had brought a lovely turkey sandwich and a big piece of chocolate cake and a crisp red apple. All he needed was a glass of milk. He knew he could get that from Miss Mush. Miss Mush didn't know how to ruin milk. Damien left his lunch on his desk and went to the end of the milk line. Joy didn't waste any time. She reached into Damien's sack and took out the apple. But then she spotted the turkey sandwich. She put back the apple, took the sandwich, and noticed the chocolate cake. She put back the sandwich and took out the cake. But then Joy had second thoughts. She put back the cake. Then she grabbed Damien's whole lunch. First she ate the sandwich. It was in a baggie. When she finished the sandwich, she placed the baggie on Jason's desk. Next she ate the chocolate cake. It was wrapped in wax paper. She put the wax paper on Allison's desk. She ate the apple last. She placed the apple core on Dee Dee's desk. Then she put the empty sack on Calvin's desk. Damien returned with his glass of milk. "Mrs. Jewls, my lunch is gone," he called. "I wonder where it could be," said Mrs. Jewls. "Calvin took it," said Joy. "There's the empty sack on his desk." "Good work, Joy," said Mrs. Jewls. "Calvin, I'm ashamed of you." She wrote Calvin's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "Look, the baggie from Damien's turkey sandwich is on Jason's desk," Joy called. "Very good, Joy," said Mrs. Jewls, "but how did you know that Damien had a turkey sandwich?" "I'm just smart," said Joy. Mrs. Jewls wrote Jason's name on the blackboard under Calvin's. "And there's the wax paper from the delicious chocolate cake on Allison's desk," Joy announced. Joy had chocolate all around her lips. Allison stood firm. She looked into Mrs. Jewls' eyes. "I didn't eat his cake," she said. "The evidence is there in your desk," said Mrs. Jewls. "Joy spotted it." She wrote Allison's name under Jason's. "Damien's apple core's on Dee Dee's desk," said Joy. "Very good, Joy," said Mrs. Jewls. She wrote Dee Dee's name under Allison's. "Damien, I think you ought to thank Joy," said Mrs. Jewls. "She solved the mystery." "Thank you, Joy," said Damien. Just then Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. "I have your lunch, Joy," he said. "Your mother brought it. You left it at home." "You mean you didn't have a lunch?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "You must be very hungry." "No," said Joy, "not really. Since Damien didn't get to eat, he can have it." "Thanks a lot," said Damien. "You are the greatest." He ate Joy's lunch, an old bologna sandwich and a dried-up carrot. "Joy, for being such a good detective and for being so generous with your lunch, you may help yourself to a Tootsie Roll Pop," said Mrs. Jewls. "They are in the coffee can on top of my desk." Joy took one, then when Mrs. Jewls wasn't looking, she took another. Calvin, Jason, Allison, and Dee Dee had their names on the blackboard under the word discipline, but they were good the rest of the day, so at 2 o'clock Mrs. Jewls erased them. They forgot all about the whole thing. Damien had a lousy lunch instead of a great lunch, but 5 minutes later it didn't make any difference. He couldn't taste it any more, and he was full. He went outside to play basketball and forgot about the whole thing. Joy had a great lunch and 2 Tootsie Roll Pops, but 5 minutes later it didn't make any difference. She couldn't taste it any more, and she was full, and at dinner time she was hungry just the same. But a horrible thing happened. Joy couldn't forget about filching Damien's lunch, and for the rest of the year every turkey sandwich, piece of chocolate cake, apple, and Tootsie Roll Pop tasted like Miss Mush's porridge. 28. Nancy. Nancy had big hands and big feet. He didn't like his name. He thought it was a girl's name. None of the other children in Mrs. Jewls' class thought that Nancy's name was odd. They didn't think of it as a girl's name or as a boy's name. Nancy was just the name of the quiet kid with the big hands and feet who sat over there in the corner next to John. Nancy was very quiet and shy. He was ashamed of his name. He had only one friend, a girl who went to class on the 23rd story of Wayside School. They were friends for a good reason. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his. They just called each other, "Hey, you," or just plain "you." Nancy was afraid to ask his friend what her name was, because then he might have to tell her his name. He never could figure out why she never asked, but he was happy just to leave well enough alone. One morning Nancy and his friend were late. When they got to the 23rd story, his friend's teacher was waiting outside. "Hurry up, you're late, Mac," said the teacher. Nancy's friend turned red. She didn't move. "Come on, Mac, shake a leg, get the lead out," said the teacher. Your name is Mac, said Nancy. Mac was very pretty. She had red hair and freckles. She covered her face and ran into the room. My name's Nancy, Nancy called after her. Mac stepped back outside. I was ashamed to tell you my name, she said. Me too, said Nancy. Nancy's a girl's name. Oh, I think it's cute, said Mac. I like the name Mac, said Nancy. Mac is a boy's name, said Mac. My mother has a rich aunt named Nancy, said Nancy. That's why she gave me the name. My mother once had a dog named Mac, said Mac. Hey, do you want to trade? Nancy asked. Can we? Asked Mac. I don't see why not, said Nancy. Okay, said Max. They both spun around 100 times in opposite directions until they were so dizzy that they fell over. When they stood up, Mac was Nancy and Nancy was Mac. They said goodbye. Then Mac ran up to Mrs. Jewell's room. He was no longer shy. Hi, everybody. My name's Mac, he announced. I traded names. He held out his big hand. Todd jumped up and shook it. Hi, Mac, he said. Glad to meet you. How you doing, Mac, said Ron. Howdy, Mac, said Terence. Nice to see you, Mac, said Phoebe. You traded names? Asked Jason. Jason didn't like his name either. That's right, Jason, old boy, said Mac. Is that allowed? Asked Jason. Why not? Said Mac. Hey, anybody want to trade? Jason called. I'll trade with you, said Terence. He didn't like his name either. Wait, I'll trade with you, Terence, said Marisha. Marisha didn't like her name. No, he's trading with me, said Jason. I'll trade with you, Marisha, said Damien. No, thanks, said Marisha. I'll trade with you, Damien, said Mrs. Jules. No, I want to be Mrs. Jules, said Stephen. It turned out that nobody in Mrs. Jules' class liked his name. The children all spun around in different directions until they got so dizzy that they fell over, and when they stood up again, nobody knew who anybody was. What are we going to do, Mrs. Jules? Asked Leslie, who was really Eric Bacon. My name is not Mrs. Jules, it's Marisha, announced Terence, who was really Jason. It is not. I'm Marisha, said Dee Dee, who was really Joe. You're both wrong, said Marisha. I'm Mrs. Jules. This went on for an hour. At last they figured out who the real Rondi was. She was missing her 2 front teeth. After they figured out Rondi, they were able to get Allison pretty easily, and then from there they got DJ, Damien, and Mrs. Jules. She was the oldest one. Eventually they figured out who everybody really was. They had some difficulty deciding which Eric was which, and actually, they are still not absolutely sure. Everybody just decided to keep his own name. The children didn't like them, but it made things much easier. Mac and Nancy kept their new names, but when they were together, they still called each other Hey You, or just plain You. Chapter 29. Stephen. Stephen had green hair, he had purple ears, and a blue face. He wore his sister's pink dancing shoes and green leotards. The leotards matched his hair. He was all dressed up as a goblin for Mrs. Jewell's Halloween party, but, unfortunately, it wasn't Halloween. You look stupid, said Jason. Jason was Stephen's best friend. So do you, said Stephen. Boy, are you dumb, said Jenny. Halloween's on Sunday. Today's only Friday. You're the one who's dumb, said Stephen. Ha ha, you probably come to school on Sunday. Mrs. Jewell said we'd have the party today. But none of the other children wore costumes, only Stephen. All right, class, said Mrs. Jewell. It's time for a Halloween party. See, said Stephen. Mrs. Jules gave each child a cookie that looked like an orange witch with a black hat. She laughed when she saw Stephen and forgot to give him one. Stephen didn't ask for it. He was afraid that she'd laugh again. The children finished their cookies in less than 30 seconds. All right, class, said Mrs. Jules. The party's over. We have a lot of work to do. Stephen felt like a fool. The party lasted less than a minute, and he had to spend the rest of the day wearing his stupid goblin suit. Look, Stephen's wearing his sister's leotards, laughed Dana. They're green, just like his hair, said Fatso. Everybody laughed. Mrs. Jules began the arithmetic lesson. She wrote on the blackboard, 2 plus 2 equals 5. That's wrong, Joy shouted. Mrs. Jules tried again. 2 plus 2 equals 3. That wasn't right either. She added 2 and 2 again and got 43. It was useless. No matter how hard she tried, she could not get 2 plus 2 to equal 4. I don't understand it, she said. They've always equaled 4 before. Suddenly she screamed. The chalk turned into a squiggling worm. She dropped it on her foot. Then all the lights went out, and the blackboard lit up like a movie screen. A woman appeared on the screen. She had a long tongue and pointed ears. She stepped off the screen and into the classroom. It was the ghost of Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Scorp rang her fingernails across the blackboard. "Trick or treat, you rotten kids," she said. "Now I'll get even with every last one of you. Where's Todd?" "Who is that?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Mrs. Gorf," said Damien. "Who's Mrs. Gorf?" asked Mrs. Jules. "She was the meanest teacher we ever had," said Rondy. "What happened to her?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Louis ate her," said Jason. "Well, I'm not going to allow this," said Mrs. Jules. "Get out of my classroom," she demanded. "It's Halloween, sweet teacher," said Mrs. Gorf. "Ghosts can go anywhere they like. I've come for a little class reunion." "But it isn't Halloween," said Mrs. Jules. "Halloween is still 2 days away." "I know," said Mrs. Gorf, "but Halloween falls on a Sunday this year, so we're celebrating it on the Friday before." Stephen leaped up from his seat. "See, I was right," he said. "Today's the day we celebrate it, the Friday before. Mrs. Gorf proved it." He ran up to Mrs. Gorf. "They all laughed at me and made me feel stupid because I was the only one who got dressed up. But they were the ones who were wrong, and you and I are right." He put his arms around Mrs. Gorf and hugged her. Mrs. Gorf gasped and disappeared. The lights came back on. Mrs. Jules picked up the piece of chalk from the floor. She wrote on the blackboard, 2 + 2 = 4. "That's good," she said. "When 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, anything can happen." All the children who had laughed at Stephen now called him a hero, but they told him to change out of his stupid costume. So at lunch, Stephen went home, washed up, and changed. He came back wearing blue jeans and a polo shirt. Of course, his hair was still green. It always was. Chapter 30. Louis. Louis had a red face and a mustache of many colors. He was the yard teacher at Wayside School. It was his job to see that the children didn't have too much fun during lunch and recess. And if you haven't already guessed, he's the one who wrote this book. On June 10th there was a blizzard. Louis was afraid that the children would have too much fun, so nobody was allowed outside. "Class," said Mrs. Jules, "after you finish your lunch today, come back up to the classroom. You are not allowed outside." The children all went to the lunchroom. Miss Mush had made tuna surprise. They looked at it, then hurried back up the stairs. There was nothing to do. "Now, class," said Mrs. Jules, "I know that you are all bored, but I have a special surprise for you." "I hope it's better than the tuna surprise," said Marisha. Mrs. Jules continued, "Louis is going to come up and entertain us. He will tell us a story. Now I want you all to be on your best behavior." When Louis walked in, all the children booed. "Are you going to tell us a story?" asked Bibi. "Yes," said Louis. "Well, it better be good," Bibi warned. "It better be better than the tuna surprise," said Butterfingers. "I thought the tuna surprise was good," said Louis. "You'd eat dirt if they put enough ketchup on it," said Mac. "Hey, everybody be quiet," said Todd. "Let him tell the story." "Not too loud, Louis," said Sherry. "I'm trying to get some sleep." Louis sat in the middle of the room, and all the children gathered around. Louis began his story. "This is a story about a school very much like this one. But before we get started, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. In this school, every classroom is on the same story." "Which one, the 18th?" asked Jenny. "No," said Louis. "They are all on the ground. The school is only 1 story high." "Not much of a school," laughed Damien. Louis continued. "Now you might think the children there are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told them stories about you, they thought that you were strange and silly." "Us?" the children answered. "How are we strange?" "I'm normal," said Stephen, "aren't I?" "As normal as I am," Joe assured him. "The children at that school must be crazy," said Leslie. "Real Lulus," Marisha agreed. "Tell us about 'em, Louis," Bibi demanded. "For one thing," Louis said, "none of those children has ever been turned into an apple." "That's silly," said Dee Dee. "Everybody's been turned into an apple. It's part of growing up." Louis continued. "Dead rats don't walk into classrooms wearing raincoats." "What do they wear, tuxedos?" asked Todd. "And girls never try to sell their toes," Louis added. "Well, no wonder," said Leslie, "at today's prices." Louis continued. "They don't trade names or read upside down. They can't turn mosquito bites into numbers. They don't count the hairs on their heads. The walls don't laugh, and 2 + 2 always equals 4. "How horrible!" said Damien. "That's not the worst of it," said Louis. "They have never tasted Marisha-flavored ice cream." A hush fell over the classroom. "Mrs. Jules, I'm scared," said Allison. "Is there really a school like that?" "Of course not," said Mrs. Jules. "Louis was just telling a story." It was a good story, said Leslie. I thought it was stupid, said Kathy. I liked it, said Rondi. It was funny. Mrs. Jules said, Louis, it was a very entertaining story, but we really don't go in for fairy tales here. I'm trying to teach my class the truth. That's all right, said Louis. I have to go down to room 29 now and tell them a story. He started out the door. Class, said Mrs. Jules, let's all thank Louis for his wonderful story. Everybody booed.